I never thought my own brother could look at me with such venom. "Give me $1.5 million, he demanded, as if my inheritance existed solely to fund his reckless dreams. When I said no, I didn't just deny him money, I shattered him. Or so I thought. Stick with me, because what happened next changed everything. It was late afternoon at the Whitmore family estate. The sun spilled gold across the polished floors, but inside, tension hung heavier than the chandelier overhead. I, Marlo Whitmore, 32, independent and careful with the trust my parents left me, was facing my younger brother, Callum, 28. He leaned against the doorway, that infuriating grin plastered across his face, the kind that used to charm everyone, except me lately. "I need it, Marlo," he said, voice sharp. "My startup is about to take off, but I can't do it without your money." "You know I'm right." His words felt like a punch. I had always protected him, guided him, kept him from making mistakes, and now he was asking for something I knew could ruin him, and possibly me if it went wrong. "I'm not giving you $1.5 million, I said firmly. My voice didn't waver, though my chest tightened with the weight of what was coming. His eyes narrowed. "You think you're better than me? You think your precious trust makes you a queen or something?" He slammed his fist on the marble table, rattling the glasses. "I deserve this, Marlo. You're just selfish." The words hit me harder than I expected. Anger, disbelief, and heartbreak tangled together. I had always hoped family meant loyalty, not this kind of entitlement. Callum stormed toward the door, but not before glancing at me with that bitter, hurtful expression, the one that screamed betrayal and accusation all at once. When the door slammed behind him, I sank into the nearest chair, shaking. My hands trembled not from fear of him, but from the realization. The brother I grew up loving, the one I'd always protected, had just revealed the depth of his selfishness. The house felt emptier, colder, and for the first time, I questioned everything I thought I knew about family. That day, I understood two things. Callum had changed, and nothing would ever be the same between us. This was only the beginning of a reckoning that neither of us could escape. After Callum left that day, I couldn't stop thinking about his demand. Something about it didn't sit right. I pulled out the papers he had left behind, his so-called startup plan. As I read through them, my stomach sank. Half of it was impossible, full of unrealistic promises and risky moves that could bankrupt anyone foolish enough to invest. And then I noticed small numbers that didn't add up, transactions that weren't supposed to be there. I remembered how he always had a way with people, charming and persuasive, making everyone feel like he was the hero of his own story. I reached out to one of his old friends, someone who had worked with him on minor projects. The stories weren't flattering. Callum had a habit of twisting facts, promising big returns he knew he couldn't deliver, and convincing others to cover his mistakes. It made me sick to see that he wasn't just reckless, he was manipulative. Then, as I dug deeper, I found evidence that made my heart pound with anger. Small sums had already disappeared from the family business accounts, transactions that weren't authorized. It wasn't just carelessness. Callum had been stealing. He had been testing boundaries, slowly taking what he wanted while I assumed he was learning responsibility. All those years of protecting him, of believing in him. I felt like a fool. I couldn't let myself spiral into guilt forever. I felt a mix of fear, anger, and disappointment all tangled up. Fear for what could happen if he got his hands on more money. Anger for how he had betrayed the trust one had given him. And a deep sadness because I realized that family wasn't a guarantee of loyalty. It could be a source of danger. I took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. I knew I couldn't confront him blindly. I needed to understand him, to see his moves before he made them. The more I discovered, the more a plan began to form in my mind. I didn't want revenge for the sake of cruelty, but for protection, for fairness, for stopping him before he could hurt himself, or me. The seeds were planted. I would watch, I would wait, and I would act. Callum's mistakes would become his downfall, but only if I stayed patient, careful, and strategic. I realized that knowing his secrets gave me power, and I wasn't going to waste it. After I refused Callum, the house felt different. The energy shifted, like a storm had passed but left the air heavy and tense. My parents didn't yell or scold him, but their eyes lingered on me longer than usual, their expressions tight. Subtle comments, small sighs, little nods. They made me feel like I was the one at fault. Suddenly, I was alone in a family that had always been my safe place. Callum didn't look back as he left. He walked out with that confident smirk, the same one he had when he believed he could charm or manipulate anyone. But I could see it in his eyes. this wasn't over. He wanted to prove himself, to show that I was wrong for standing my ground. That thought made my chest tighten. I knew his ambitions were reckless, but his pride could make him dangerous. I started noticing small things over the next few days. My parents' questions were pointed, asking if I was being too harsh or not supportive enough. Friends and relatives who had once been neutral now looked at me differently, as if I had betrayed family loyalty. Callum didn't need to say a word. His absence alone was already shaking things up. I felt the walls closing in. One night, I sat alone in my study, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. I let myself cry for the first time since that confrontation. Not just tears of anger, but of heartbreak. I realized betrayal cuts deeper than money. It cuts into trust, into the years you spent protecting someone, into the belief that family should always have your back. The weight of it pressed down, leaving me drained and hollow. But among the tears, a small clarity emerged. I could feel the first sparks of determination. Callum might try to hurt me financially or ruin my reputation, but I wasn't going to let him. I wouldn't fight blindly, but I would protect myself. I knew I had to be smarter, faster, and more careful than ever. That night, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let betrayal define me. I would not let anger control me. I would watch, plan, and act when the time was right. Callum's smirk had marked the beginning of something, but it wouldn't be his victory. It would be the start of my resolve. After the fallout, I knew I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to understand what Callum was really up to. I started paying attention to his moves, quietly tracking his calls, emails, and meetings. I wasn't spying for fun. I needed to know how deep his recklessness went and if it could touch me or the family trust. It didn't take long before I found things that made my stomach turn. Hidden in plain sight were contracts with signatures that looked off, transactions that didn't make sense, and accounts that seemed to have money moving in ways that were not approved. Callum had been trying to cover it up, thinking no one was paying attention. But I saw it. Every forged document, every small embezzlement attempt, it all painted a clear picture. I leaned back in my chair, the evidence spread in front of me, and realized something important. I had leverage. I could stop him before things got worse, but I couldn't act recklessly. One wrong move, and he could twist it back on me, or worse, cause real damage to the trust. I had to be careful, precise, and smart. Meanwhile, Callum had started a new venture, small but risky, full of promises he couldn't possibly keep. He walked around with that same confidence he always had, acting untouchable, believing no one could see through him. It annoyed me, but it also gave me an advantage. Overconfidence makes people careless, and Callum was already showing cracks. I began to plan. Not with anger, not with revenge for the sake of hurting him, but with a strategy that combined intellect and patience. Every move he made, I noted. Every weakness I uncovered became a potential tool. I imagined scenarios in my mind. How I could protect myself, how I could make him face the consequences of his actions, and how I could reclaim control without stepping into the chaos he was creating. There was a thrill in knowing I could act, but it was tempered by caution. This wasn't a game. Family, trust, money, it all mattered, and one mistake could ruin everything. Yet, for the first time since that confrontation, I felt a spark of power. I wasn't powerless. I had a plan forming, and when the time came, I would strike. Callum might think he was untouchable, but he had no idea what was coming. A few days later, Callum called me again, sounding frustrated but trying to hide it behind charm. "Marlo, I don't know what you're thinking. You're making it impossible for me to succeed." "I thought family had each other's backs," he said, his voice soft but edged with guilt tripping. I could hear the old manipulation in his tone, the same one he had used for years. I decided to play along, pretending to be worried. "Callum, I worry about you sometimes. I don't want to see you fail or get hurt. I want you to succeed, but safely," I said gently, keeping my voice calm. He relaxed, thinking he had me on his side. That was exactly what I wanted. He started opening up, telling me things he'd never shared before. He spoke about investors he was courting, deadlines he couldn't meet, deals he thought were foolproof, and partnerships that were far from stable. He didn't realize he was handing me all the ammunition I needed. Every word, every detail revealed weaknesses he thought he had hidden. It was like watching someone walk into a trap they couldn't see. As I listened, I felt a mixture of emotions. Anger bubbled up. How could he try to guilt me after everything? Sadness weighed on me too, because he was my brother, and family wasn't supposed to play these games. But beneath it all, there was a thrill, a spark of satisfaction. I had the upper hand, and I was finally starting to see a way to protect myself and hold him accountable without losing control. I stayed patient, letting him talk himself into overconfidence. Every lie he believed, every plan he thought would succeed, was building a foundation for what I was planning. I reminded myself that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about making him face the consequences of his own choices. By the end of the conversation, Callum felt reassured, thinking I was still worried for him, still supportive. I hung up, heart pounding, feeling both heavy and sharp with anticipation. He had no idea that in trying to manipulate me, he had already handed me the power. The first threads of my plan were coming together, and the knowledge that he was unknowingly exposing himself made every moment more intense. I knew I had to keep my patience, but I also knew that soon all of his overconfidence and deception would come back to him. Callum had been talking nonstop about a new investor he found, someone who promised big returns and even bigger opportunities. He was thrilled, completely blind to the warning signs. I listened carefully as he bragged to a mutual acquaintance, pretending to be excited about his big break. But I saw through it. This was reckless, and the investor had a shady reputation that could ruin him. I knew I couldn't let him go headfirst into disaster, but I also had to be careful. I couldn't touch the money directly. That would be obvious. Instead, I started quietly gathering information and making subtle moves behind the scenes. I alerted some contacts to delays in paperwork, raised questions about the contracts with the right people, and made sure the investor got little hints that something wasn't right. Nothing traceable back to me, but enough to slow things down. It didn't take long before the first signs appeared. Calls that used to go smoothly were suddenly filled with tension. Emails went unanswered, and deadlines were missed. Callum grew frustrated, pacing his small office, muttering about how investors were suddenly difficult and unreliable. Legal notices and warnings started arriving, things he hadn't anticipated, and he began to realize that maybe not everyone was on his side. Watching him struggle, I felt a rush of empowerment. After weeks of planning and patience, I could see the first real cracks in his confident facade. He had acted like he was untouchable, and now, without even realizing it, he was on shaky ground. But along with that empowerment came conflict. He was my brother. I had loved him, protected him, and in a way I still did. Hurting him, even to stop him from ruining himself, felt like a betrayal on my part too. I reminded myself that this wasn't about cruelty. This was about consequences. Callum had made choices that put him and others at risk, and I had the chance to make sure he faced them responsibly, or at least safely. By the end of the week, he was calling me, frustrated and panicked, asking what he had done wrong, why everything was falling apart. I stayed calm, offered vague advice, and let him vent. Inside, I was calculating every next step, knowing that with each delay and each warning, he was closer to seeing the results of his own recklessness. The betrayal ran deep, but so did the lesson he was about to learn. By the time dinner came around, Callum could no longer hide his frustration. He knew something or someone was working against him, but he didn't know who. The house felt tense, quieter than usual, the kind of silence that carries weight in every glance and movement. I set the table carefully, keeping my expression neutral, waiting for the right moment. He arrived, pacing slightly, trying to appear casual, but his hands fidgeted with the napkin, his jaw tight. "You know, Marlowe, things have been complicated lately," he said, attempting to sound light, but I could hear the edge in his voice. "I don't know why everything is falling apart." I met his gaze calmly, placing a fork down slowly. "Complicated?" I asked softly. "Is that what you're calling it?" There was no anger in my tone, just quiet observation. He stiffened, sensing that I knew more than I was letting on. Callum leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I don't understand. I've done everything to make this work. I thought I could count on you." His eyes searched mine, trying to read my expression to find weakness. "I've always been here for you, Callum," I said, my voice steady. "That hasn't changed. But I can't fix what you choose to ignore. I can't protect you from your own mistakes anymore." My words were calm, but the weight behind them was heavy. He slammed his hand on the table, startling me. "Are you blaming me? Or are you blaming yourself?" His voice cracked with frustration and desperation. "You're acting like you're perfect, like you've done nothing wrong." I took a deep breath, letting my feelings show just enough to pierce the tension. "I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes too. But I have never betrayed this family, and I certainly haven't lied, stolen, or manipulated to get what I want. You have Callum. You've broken trust, not just with me, but with Mom and Dad. And now it's time you face that. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Callum's face flushed with anger, guilt, and disbelief, all at once. I stayed calm, letting him feel the weight of my words. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply told the truth, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. That night, I finally let myself acknowledge how deep the betrayal cut. It wasn't about the money. It was about trust, love, and the hope that family should be family. And as much as it hurt, saying it aloud made me feel stronger, like I had taken the first step toward reclaiming control. By now, the consequences of Callum's mistakes were becoming impossible to ignore. Investors he had counted on were backing out, citing doubts and missed deadlines. His small venture was collapsing fast, and I watched it all unfold from a distance, careful not to interfere directly, but making sure he couldn't quietly recover. Every misstep, every failed meeting, every frustrated call chipped away at the confidence he had carried like armor for so long. When he realized he was losing control, he started selling assets he thought could save him. Cars, small properties, even some business equipment. He tried to liquidate everything he could, but it wasn't enough. The network of delays, warnings, and cautious contacts I had quietly put in place ensured that every move he made was just enough to slow him down and expose his vulnerabilities. I also used the family trust to my advantage. There were clauses that allowed me some oversight, and I made sure those were enforced without appearing overly controlling. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about balance, about making sure Callum faced the natural consequences of his own recklessness and couldn't turn the trust into another tool for manipulation. The day he called me, his voice was completely different from before. There was no smugness, no charm, no deflection. "Marlo, please. I didn't think it would get this bad. Can you help me? I need your guidance," he said, desperation bleeding through every word. I stayed calm, listening, letting him feel the weight of his own actions. Inside, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, yes, the kind that comes from seeing justice done and a plan succeed. But it wasn't joyful in a happy way. It was quiet, calculated, and deeply earned. I had watched him overreach, manipulate, and betray, and now he was seeing the results of his choices without me needing to act violently or cruelly. I reminded myself that this wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. This was about protection, about teaching a lesson, about reclaiming control in a situation where family loyalty had been weaponized against me. Seeing Callum humbled, pleading for help, and realizing the fragility of his own position gave me an emotional clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. By the end of the day, he was broken but alive, facing the consequences he had ignored. And I felt a sense of relief and empowerment. My revenge had been precise, measured, and devastating in its effectiveness, but it hadn't destroyed him completely. It had simply reminded him, and everyone watching, that actions have consequences, even within a family. Callum's failures were no longer hidden. Investors talked quietly at gatherings, gossip spread through business circles, and soon even distant relatives heard about his collapse. What he had once flaunted with pride, his plans, his confidence, his charm, crumbled into public humiliation. I watched from a distance as he struggled to explain missed deadlines and failed deals, his face flushed with embarrassment he couldn't charm away. At the same time, the family dynamics began to shift. My parents, who had subtly questioned me in the past, now seemed uncertain, even wary around Callum. The quiet authority I had maintained while watching and waiting became visible to them. I didn't announce it or demand recognition, but they saw it in the way I carried myself, in the careful decisions I made, and in the calm that replaced their previous unease. The power balance had changed, and it was undeniable. Yet, triumph felt hollow in ways I hadn't expected. Revenge had been precise and calculated, but it came at an emotional cost. I thought I was prepared to face the fallout, to endure the tension and the heartbreak, but watching Callum humbled and hearing his apologies only made me realize how much I had lost along the way. Not money, not control, but the sense of family I once believed was unbreakable. I spent quiet evenings reflecting on everything. The betrayal, the planning, the small victories, they all left marks. I had felt anger, fear, sadness, and a strange thrill as my plan unfolded. But with each step, I had also felt isolation growing. Family loyalty had been broken, trust had been shattered, and I had played a part in that, even if it was necessary. Questions lingered in my mind. Could I ever forgive Callum, or had the damage gone too deep? Could the family recover, or was this the beginning of a permanent divide? The uncertainty weighed on me more than any victory ever could. I realized that revenge doesn't heal all wounds, and power doesn't replace love or trust. Still, I felt a quiet strength I hadn't known before. I had acted decisively, protected myself, and forced truth into the open. I had faced betrayal and ensured accountability. But the cost of that triumph was evident in the silence of my home, the empty spaces where family trust used to live. I was triumphant, yes, but deeply, achingly alone, and I knew that some lessons, once learned, can never be forgotten. Callum left town a few weeks later, carrying the weight of his failures with him. He didn't say goodbye, just packed his things and disappeared, leaving messages that were equal parts anger and regret. He made it clear in every word he sent that he would never forgive me, that our bond was broken beyond repair. I didn't argue, didn't try to convince him otherwise. I had done what I had to do, and now it was up to him to live with it. The house felt different after he left. Quiet, almost peaceful. I could finally breathe without the tension of his schemes hanging in the air. I spent the mornings in my study, reviewing my plans, my finances, and thinking about the future. For the first time in months, I felt a calm clarity. But alongside that calm, a realization settled in. Trust in my family could not be rebuilt easily. What had been broken, the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, left cracks that might never fully heal. One evening, I wandered into the living room and found myself staring at the old family photos on the wall. Pictures of Callum and me as kids, smiling together in the garden, celebrating birthdays, sharing vacations. Memories of laughter and trust, moments when family felt safe and simple. My heart tightened as I traced the frames with my fingers, feeling a mix of love, sorrow, and disappointment. Those moments were real, but they also reminded me of what was lost and how fragile family bonds can be when crossed by selfishness and deceit. I thought about all the steps I had taken, every careful move, every moment of patience, every quiet plan to ensure Callum faced the consequences of his own choices. Revenge had been measured, necessary, and effective. And yet it came with a price. Emotional exhaustion, loneliness, and the bitter understanding that some relationships cannot be fixed, no matter how much you want them to be. Sitting there, I understood the truth about boundaries, family, and self-respect. I had protected myself, reclaimed control, and ensured that no one could use my trust to destroy me. And in that clarity, I found a strange peace. I whispered to myself, looking at the photos one last time. I didn't just refuse him $1.50 million. I refused him the right to destroy me. In that moment, I realized it wasn't about money or power. It was about surviving betrayal, standing firm, and learning that sometimes the most important victory is simply keeping yourself intact. This story shows the importance of setting boundaries, understanding family trust laws, and protecting your finances. Learn to recognize manipulation, act strategically, and prioritize self-respect. Always document agreements, stay informed about your legal rights, and remember, standing firm isn't cruelty. It's responsible protection of yourself and your future.